A strange oversight, you will say, but it seems it was a discovery denied to Christ and to all the apostles, and reserved to these last times. Answerable to this was the practice of the godly Bereans, who did examine St. Paul's doctrine, not by tradition, as the papists do, but by the Scripture, in Acts 17, verse 11. And St. Paul himself evidenceth the soundness of his doctrine, not by its conformity with tradition, which our adversaries lay such stress upon, that as Clarea with several others affirm that they receive the Scripture only so far as they agree with tradition, but by its consonancy to the Scripture, saying that he witnessed none other thing than what was in Moses and the prophets, Acts 26, verse 22, and Acts 24, verses 14 and 15. So then the question now is, which is the more rational way to resolve a Christian's doubts and ground his faith, whether that which hath had the approbation of all the holy men of God in both testaments, or the ingenious device of these witty doctors that come with their quintum evangelium into the world, that is, whether Scripture or tradition. I know one thing will be said, that the apostles did urge traditions as well as Scriptures. To this purpose we oft hear of that 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 15, hold the tradition which ye have been taught, whether by word or our epistle. To which I answer briefly, first, that if the papists can demonstrate any of their traditions to be indeed apostolical, as these were, we shall receive them, if conformable to Scripture. But if they be dissonant from Scripture, we have commission from St. Paul to renounce them, though they be either of apostolical or angelical original. Galatians 1, verses 18 and verse 9. Secondly, the argument, I confess, is right of the Romish stamp. That is, the Thessalonians were bound to receive what they heard immediately from St. Paul's mouth, and such things as for the substance of them were contained in the Scripture. Therefore, we are now bound to receive all those traditions which the Church of Rome tell us they had from those that had them from those that had them from those that told them their ancestors were told by their ancestors that some of their ancestors had it from Paul 1600 years ago. This may serve for the fourth answer. Section 9. Answer. Fifth. If this doctrine be true, Scripture proof is not necessary for any point in religion, for it asserts the sufficiency of tradition in itself and without the Scripture. But Scripture proof is necessary for confirmation of points in religion. This I might prove from Scripture, but that hath been done already in the former answer. Therefore I shall here confute this argument of tradition by tradition in the testimony of the Fathers. To pick up all they have to this purpose would fill volumes. I shall therefore single out some few illustrious testimonies. Nothing can more evidently overthrow this goodly structure than those forementioned words of Cyprian. We ought not to regard what others have done before us, but what Christ, who was before all, thought fit to be done. For we must follow God's truth, not men's custom. What Protestant can say more in few words than Clemens Alexandrinus in few words? We assert nothing without Scripture. Therefore he thought not tradition a sure evidence, though so near the fountain. Much less can it now give us any certainty, having conflicted with hazards and been exposed to the infection of 1300 years. St. Basil is express. It is necessary that every word or thing be confirmed by the Holy Scriptures. And elsewhere he tells you, it is a manifest defection from the faith and token of pride, either to reject anything that is written or to introduce anything that is not written. And Constantine, speaking of the rule by which all things were to be examined and judged, confines it to the Scripture. The books of the prophets and apostles, saith he, do plainly instruct us what to think of divine things. Therefore, laying aside hostile discord from the words which were divinely inspired, let us take our expositions of questions. It is a pitiful shift, of Bellarmine's to say that Constantine was a better emperor than doctor, whereas in this particular Theodoret assures us that the whole synod did highly approve of this saying, nor did any of the ancients ever condemn him for it. And indeed the practice of the synod shows their approbation of the speech, and consequently gives us another argument. For they determine the controversy according to the Scriptures, saith Ambrose, and Athanasius, to whose the words are these. the bishops congregated at Nicaea, collecting together all things they could out of Scripture to defend their opinion. They affirmed that the Son was consubstantial to the Father, and Bellarmine himself confesseth it. The Council of Nicaea, when they defined the Son to be consubstantial to the Father, they drew their conclusion out of the Scriptures. Notable is that place of Chrysostom's, because it acquaints us with his own judgment and the judgment of the Christians of that age. If anything be asserted, saith he, without Scripture, the mind of the hearer wavers. But when Scripture comes, that confirms the speaker's words and settles the hearer's mind. Tertullian thus confutes the opinion of Hermogenes that things were made of pre-existing matter with, I never read it. Let Hermogenes show where it is written, or else let him fear the woe denounced against those that add to the Scripture. And again, I do not receive what thou bringest of thy own without the Scripture. And again, take away from heretics the things they have in common with heathens, that they may refer their questions to Scripture alone, and they can never stand. But the papists are of another mind. If you will believe them, if Scripture alone must judge controversies, heresies will never fall. Theodoret professeth he was not so bold as to assert anything wherein the Scripture was silent. Thus Origen, it is necessary that we call in the testimony of Scripture, for without this our expositions have no credit. Austin is most full and plain. I will mention but one place. Whether they have the Church, they cannot show, but from the canonical books of Scripture. And yet there is no question wherein tradition seems more pertinent, and where the papists urge it with more vehemency. I might add 1,000 pregnant places more, but either these or none will suffice to prove that the ancients did judge Scripture proof necessary for the confirmation of any doctrine in religion, which the Romanists now judge not necessary. The Fathers pretended tradition for their opinion, and the Papists pretend it now. Either tradition deceived the Fathers then, or it deceives the Papists now. Either will serve our turn to show the fallibility of tradition. If it be said, there are no less express testimonies alleged by the Papists on the behalf of tradition, and why should not they be received as well as those on the behalf of the Scripture? I answer first. If the Fathers do in some places assert the sufficiency of proof from tradition, and in other places the necessity of Scripture proof, these assertions being directly contrary one to another, it invalidates their authority in matters of religion. For so say the lawyers most justly and truly, testis pugnantia dicens fidem non facit. Secondly, but upon enquiry it will be found in the places cited for tradition, especially if you compare them with those alleged for Scripture, that they do plead tradition only as a secondary argument to confirm that faith which is grounded upon Scripture. But it is as clear as the sun that they ever made tradition strike sail to the Scripture, and make no scruple of deserting tradition when the evidence of Scripture arguments stood on the other side. Answer number 6. The Romanists themselves are undeniable instances of the vanity of their own argument. They tell us tradition cannot deceive us. Why, tradition hath deceived them. There are diverse contradictory opinions maintained in the Church of Rome. About 300 are reckoned out by Bellarmine. The dissenters, though never so implacably divided amongst themselves, do agree in this, that they believe nothing but what hath come to them by tradition from their fathers, and so from the apostles. Then certainly either tradition hath deceived some of them, or both the parts of a contradiction may be true. I shall not launch forth into the sea of Romish contradictions, nor take notice of petty differences amongst obscure authors, but shall instance in 2 material points. That is, the doctrine of God's grace and man's will, and the appurtenances as they are controverted between the French and Italian papists. In both of them it is as clear as the sun that both parties pretend tradition. Now the trumpet of tradition gives an uncertain sound, for tradition tells the Jesuits this is truth. That the will is determined to good actions, not by God's grace, but by its own inclination and agency. Tradition tells the Dominicans and Jansenists that this is a gross falsity. So for the Church, if you inquire in whom supreme authority and infallibility resides? For that is the great question. Tradition tells the Jesuits it is in the Pope. Tradition not long since told the councils of Basel and Constance that it was in a council, not in the Pope, and so it tells many of the French doctors at this day. And I will tell you a thing in your ear. Both these are apostolical traditions, though you and I think they are directly contrary. It is so true what St. James saith, no fountain can yield both salt water and fresh, in James 3, verses 8 and 12.